topic-specific statements and condemning the human rights violations that are taking place in Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members and staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for holding this important hearing. Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I'd like to summarize my remarks and ask that my full statement be made part of the record. In addition, I'd like to submit for the record our full report, as well as a list of Bahraini doctors whose whereabouts remain unknown in the wake of the government crackdown against medical personnel. In previous statements, we heard that thousands of protesters took to the streets in Bahrain, calling for government reform earlier this year. The government's response was brutal and systematic. Shoot civilian protesters, detain and torture them, and erase all the evidence. On the front line, treating hundreds of these wounded civilians, doctors had first-hand knowledge of these government abuses. The assault on healthcare workers and their patients violates the principle of medical neutrality as well as international law. As part of a Physicians for Human Rights investigation in Bahrain in April of this year, my colleague, Dr. Nitsam Pirwani, and I conducted in-depth interviews with 47 medical personnel, patients, and other eyewitnesses to human rights violations. We corroborated these testimonies by conducting physical examinations of beaten and tortured civilian protesters. In addition, we examined their medical records and x-rays and also investigated 4 suspicious deaths in custody. Our investigation produced strong evidence that the government of Bahrain has systematically targeted medical personnel as a result of their efforts to provide ethical and unbiased care for wounded protesters. These systematic attacks include abductions of physicians, sometimes in the middle of the night, taken from their homes in front of their children and loved ones, handcuffed, blindfolded by armed and masked security forces. For each doctor, nurse, or medic that the government disappears, many more civilians' lives are impacted as patients go untreated. In conflict situations around the world, there is a unique and highly qualified community of professionals who bring comfort and compassion to those in need. Medical workers in all countries are bound by their professional ethics to provide care without consideration of religion, ethnicity, or other status. Because doctors are trained to apply their skills without discrimination, they glean first-hand knowledge of types of injury and numbers of deaths during a conflict or during civil unrest. And importantly, they can discern the cause of injury and death. That expertise and knowledge make doctors important eyewitnesses to government abuses, and in the case of Bahrain, make them targets themselves. During our investigation last month, we gathered evidence about these and other egregious abuses against patients and detainees, including torture, beating, humiliation, threats of rape, and killing. Our documentation and forensic evidence enable us to conclude the following. 1. Government authorities used excessive force, including high-velocity weapons and shotguns, often fired at close range, aiming at the faces and heads of unarmed protesters. 2. Security forces used unidentified chemical agents which caused disorientation, aphasia, and convulsions. 3. Perhaps most alarming during my investigation was listening to numerous eyewitnesses, patients who described similar accounts of being tortured by security forces on the 6th floor of Salamnia Hospital, supposedly a refuge for the sick and injured. Regarding issues of medical neutrality, I gathered corroborated evidence that Bahraini forces physically attacked 6 Shi'a physicians who were on call the night of April 3rd at Salamnia Hospital, used ambulances for military purposes, and stole uniforms to pose as medics, apparently to get closer to protesters, and militarized hospitals and clinics, which continue to obstruct patients from seeking urgent medical care. The assault on healthcare workers and their patients constitutes extreme violations of the principle of medical neutrality and are grave breaches of international law. In conclusion, I propose the following actions on the part of the U.S. government. 1. The administration's, quote, mild approach toward Bahrain, as characterized in a May 9th Washington Post editorial, has failed to curb government abuses, and doctors are still being disappeared. Senior members of the administration, including the President, should instead speak out publicly and in no uncertain terms against ongoing human rights abuses by government authorities. The administration should also demand the immediate and unconditional release of all detained medical personnel. 2. Members of Congress and the administration should visit Salminia Hospital and meet with representatives of the medical community in Bahrain. 3. The United States should spearhead an international effort to create a new mandate for a special rapporteur on violations of medical neutrality through the United Nations Human Rights Council. 4. Physicians for Human Rights would like to thank Representative McDermott for his leadership on issues of medical neutrality over the years and for introducing a bill dedicated to protecting and promoting medical neutrality through U.S. foreign policy. We encourage all members to support passage of this bill, which would, among other things, suspend non-humanitarian foreign assistance to countries violating medical neutrality, support a UN mandate for a special rapporteur on violations of medical neutrality, and add the reporting of violations of medical neutrality to the annual U.S. State Department Human Rights Country Reports. I am confident that through these efforts, the U.S. government can become an international leader in the protection and promotion of medical neutrality. I thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
I want to thank all three of you for excellent presentations here, and I'd like to insert in the record the statement by Congressman Jim McDermott, who can't be here today, so I'll be part of the record. Let me again express my disappointment that the administration our administration chose not to send a witness here, but I'd like to get, and both Joe and Richard, you've talked about this, but I want to have the record be clear. Based on your observations, what has been the role of the following U.S. government entities in responding to the human rights situation in Bahrain? I mean, the White House. You both asked the President to be more vocal on this. I mean, up to this point, what has the White House done?
Well, the White House has just about 10 days ago, the President called King Hamad. This was probably less than 48 hours before Osama bin Laden was killed, so it was a very busy time, and the fact that the President took that time to pick up the phone and speak to the King was very good. The one paragraph readout that we got from the White House of that phone call was somewhat encouraging, but again, it was very, very general. It talked about emphasizing universal principles and the importance of democracy, and violence is not the answer. I mean, all of things none of us here would disagree with, and all well and good. But again, they were not. We don't know what was raised actually specifically in the call, but we do know that publicly very little has been said. We also know. I am confident the administration has tried. Look, on February 17th, after the Army came out and shot dead an additional 5 or 7 protesters that night, the Army was off the streets the next day. And I have no doubt at all, although there's no public confirmation of this, that the United States played a role in that. So it intervened effectively outside of the public glare, which is fine. It worked. We also know that on the weekend of March 14th, 15th, 16th, the United States did try. Mr. Feltman was in Bahrain then.
My second question was to be the State Department. So Mr. Feltman went to...
Mr. Feltman has made a number of visits.
Mr. Feltman is the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs.
Right.
For the record.
Right. And we understand that he worked hard and long into the night to try and forestall the Saudi military intervention, the declaration of martial law, and so forth, and get a dialogue going. We can't say back on track because it never really got going. Those efforts failed, but I do believe the administration did try. I think it has continued to raise these issues that we've raised today quietly. What hasn't happened, and we know there's instructions from the top level of the administration that we're just not going to do this publicly.
Well, Mr. Solomon, let me ask you a question. You talk about Salminia Hospital. to your knowledge, did anyone from the embassy or anybody from the administration go to visit that hospital? Have they been to any of the sites that you mentioned in your report? Have they interviewed some of these doctors? What is your knowledge of what has been done?
To my knowledge, the administration or embassy officials in Bahrain have not made those visits. If they have made those visits, they're quite welcome, but then they should speak out about what they found.
Miriam, let me, we got a lot of calls the last couple of days about this hearing, and again, I welcome the calls. But I think just for the record, I mean, I'd like you to address an issue that was raised in a number of calls, and that was that, you know, how do you respond to those who would say that the Bahrain Center for Human Rights and its members have provoked the violence against the Bahraini government? That was a common theme in some of the calls, but I'd like you to have an opportunity to respond to that.
Well, as a center, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights has been for several years now, since 2002 when it was founded. It has been documenting human rights violations. Now, apart from being a center of human rights in general, the center has also helped in setting up several committees. For example, the Committee for Expat Rights, the Committee for Unemployment, the Committee for Against Torture. So the center is pretty well known, not only nationally, but also internationally for the work that it does. We also partner with organizations or work with organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, FIDH, IFEX, and so on. So when it comes to international credibility, I believe that we do have that. As for provoking violence, I think the Bahrain Center for Human Rights have made it very clear that we condemn any kind of violence, no matter where it's coming from, whether it's coming from the authorities or coming from civilians. Any kind of violence is condemned and should not be used for any reason. So I think, and we've also put out several reports on that. So I think that's very clear.
Thank you. To what extent could human rights groups in Bahrain operate before the protests began in mid-February?
Well, the Bahrain Center was, shall we say, legally unrecognized by the government in 2004, I believe, after the then president, Abdulhadi Khawaja, made a public speech criticizing the prime minister. So they've continued. Now, they have no legal standing. Their assets were confiscated, but they have been, shall we say, tolerated. I mean, they have continued to function by and large, not without harassment, but they have continued to function. The Bahrain Human Rights Society, which was set up a year or so earlier, and has maintained its sort of legal standing, but when it spoke out against somewhat loudly and publicly against torture, the Ministry of Social Development, whose purview includes NGOs generally and human rights organizations specifically, basically fired the board. A hostile takeover wouldn't be an unfair characterization of what happened. There's been Mr. Darazi, who's the Secretary General. His role was suspended. He's a teacher at the university, and I believe his role there, his livelihood, has also more recently, within the last several weeks, been suspended. So overall, I'd say it's not good. There are a number of what we call gangos, government-instituted NGOs that do operate in Bahrain and in the Gulf region. These are appear to be the ones that the Sheikh refers to in his submitted testimony as being allowed to attend the trials because our representative was not allowed in.
Yeah, that's the other issue. They say that the government says that international human rights NGOs are open and operating in Bahrain and are under no restrictions on their activities. Clearly,
I'm afraid that's completely untrue. A colleague from Human Rights First was in Bahrain until this morning, who tried to get into the trial yesterday and was prevented from doing so. So I don't know where that idea of unrestricted access comes from. It's certainly not from reality on the ground.
And what about Physicians for Human Rights in the aftermath of your report? I mean,
perhaps I could.
You testified that you're no longer welcome in Bahrain, right? Yeah. Have you gotten a letter like that yet?
We haven't gotten a letter, but perhaps pertinent to this discussion is on my last day in Bahrain, Friday, April 8th, I was encouraged over the phone by a staff person at the Ministry of Health to go visit Salminia Hospital, which is an 821-bed tertiary care facility, the best in the country. And he said that Physicians for Human Rights had free access to the entire kingdom, including the hospital. He set about arranging an official visit to the hospital, and then an hour later called me back to say that that would not be possible, that they could not get permission from the Ministry of Interior or the BDF, the Bahraini Defense Forces, who of course control both the security and administration of that hospital ever since mid-March. We decided at the encouragement of that person from the Ministry of Health to go visit the hospital. We showed up an hour later at 11 a.m. We were met by armed security forces. There is a heavy tank outside the emergency department entrance, sitting in the middle of a parking lot. There were about 20 police vehicles, riot police vehicles, several dozen security forces wearing green fatigues, blue uniforms, security forces also wearing black uniforms. Most of them were wearing black wool ski masks to hide their identity. We were not met with a welcome reception, as the Ministry of Health claims that we did. We were immediately taken outside once we entered the hospital to a small room where we were detained under armed guard for about a half hour while they tried to, they interrogated us, asking us why we were there. We said that we were Physicians for Human Rights, that we wanted to visit the hospital and speak with medical personnel, and that the Ministry of Health encouraged us to come. About a half hour later, we were escorted out of the medical complex under armed guards. So I explain this circumstance just to let you know that what the government is saying to the media and publicly is it's quite a different story, what's taking place on the ground for human rights organizations, both international as well as local.
Obviously, you have firsthand, this is a firsthand account. Mr. Storr.
I just wanted to add that with regard to Human Rights Watch's relations with the government of Bahrain, until recently they've been quite good. As an organization, and I myself personally, have had frequent and high-level access to the government. So the issues we're talking about are fairly recent, the last few months. But what we're talking about is a trend which is in the direction of closure rather than opening.
And what about members of the Center for Human Rights that are operating in Bahrain now? What is their situation?
Well, we have, I only have 2 colleagues left that have not been arrested. One of them is in complete hiding. We don't know where he is, but he has been doing some work from where he's hiding. And then there's the president of our center who's been banned from traveling, and he's under threat of arrest at any time. There's also been massive defamation campaigns that are being carried out in trying to tarnish the center's reputation or discredit them. So there's several things that are happening on the ground and trying to stop the work of the center from happening, especially the reporting about the violations.
What is the current status of your father?
Well, the last we know is that yesterday there was a hearing. The hearing was adjourned until next Monday, but the lawyers at the hearing, they requested that they get more time with the detainees, as they had not been allowed enough time with the detainees, and they also requested that the prison conditions be made better because the prison conditions were quite bad. Of course, the attorney from the government said that that was not true and the conditions were well. The lawyers also requested more bathroom time for the detainees. One of the lawyers requested that the detainees be let out on bail and that they would attend the trial, but the judge said that that was not possible, as the sentence for the charges, if found guilty, would either be life imprisonment or a death sentence, which is very concerning, of course. My father was the only person from amongst the detainees who was not allowed to meet with his family after the hearing. And we believe that this is probably because at the end of the session, he told the judge that he feared for his life, as he had been receiving threats from security that he was going to be killed. And that's the last thing we know. Of course, we also fear for his health as he has the fractures in his face.
Let me ask all of you here. I mean, do you have, we talked about the actions against the protesters. Do we have any evidence that U.S.-made equipment was used against the protesters? And if so, what is the basis of that evidence, and what types of equipment were used?
I just wanted to make a quick comment because I don't have a lot of background in arms, but I personally saw tear gas canisters and rubber bullet canisters that said "Made in the U.S., Pennsylvania." So that's as far as I know.
Richard?
I was going to say the same thing, that walking through the streets of Manama, as well as smaller, say, suburban areas outside of the capital where Shia predominantly live, you see canisters of CS gas, tear gas, with the markings, as Mariam said, with "Made in the United States." What is important to note about this is that CS gas is not a controlled substance. It is legal. However, that there are UN guidelines for how police officers and security forces use tear gas. As Physicians for Human Rights has documented over the past couple of decades, since 1987 at least, tear gas can be a lethal agent. It is not supposed to be used in enclosed spaces, and we documented at least 2 cases where security forces in Bahrain launched tear gas into people's homes where people were sleeping in the middle of the night, as well as at a wedding party. Again, people can die from tear gas. We only need to remember what took place in Waco, Texas, a number of years ago, where 84 people were killed. Some of the children died from CS gas. So this is a common occurrence, and it should not, this is what I mean by excessive use of force.
Yes, sure.
What my colleagues have mentioned is consistent with our findings. We also looked into the origin of the pellet gun, the birdshot, since so many people actually had died as a result of misuse of that riot control equipment. The point of origin was Pakistan, which is kind of ironic since many of the security forces that were using these weapons are also from Pakistan.
Mayor, let me ask you, you have previously discussed in other settings that you had good friendships with Sunnis in Bahrain. Can you discuss what the relationships are currently between typical Sunnis and Shia in Bahrain?
Well, actually, one of my closest friends since I moved to Bahrain is Sunni. I also have many other Sunni friends. Since the beginning of the protest, people who are in support of the government of Bahrain have become more, I don't know if I want to use the word militant, but they've become very defensive, or rather, the way that they would speak to the people who were participating in the protest would be in this form of attacks or insults. As a human rights activist, I've seen a lot of that myself. But also the protesters, being that they were Shia Sunnis and otherwise, made it very clear that the issue at hand was not about sectarianism or about the discrimination that was ongoing against the Shia sect in Bahrain, but rather it was an issue of human rights and freedoms. But unfortunately, the government has been able to spin it into a sectarian issue, and thus most of the attacks, especially that we're seeing online today, is sectarian attacks that would happen from one side to another, sometimes vice versa as well. And I think this is a very dangerous territory that we're stepping into, not only on the national sense, but also regionally, being that some states are Sunni and some states are Shia in the region. I also think that one of the recommendations that I have been making to State Department was that there needs to be urgent action not only for human rights in Bahrain and because of the violations, but also because if this situation does continue and if people are still oppressed for a very long time, then Iran might actually become a threat, a valid threat in the region. Since today, up until now, as far as we know, the protesters have denounced these statements coming from Iran and have made it very clear that they do not want any kind of intervention coming from Iran. But if this does continue, then it's only logical that they will start looking for someone to support them.
Either you or Mr. Stork mentioned the destruction of some of mosques that are going on. Can you give us some more details on what's happening?
You want to?
We were just starting to look into that when we our presence in Bahrain ended, thanks to the government. But we do know that we did start to look into that. The government has justified these demolitions on the grounds that these were illegal constructions, they were not properly zoned, the proper permits were not gotten, and so forth. But we know that in some cases we're talking about mosques and other religiously important structures that have been around for decades, frankly, and where, in fact, highways had been rerouted in order to preserve them in the past, and today they don't exist anymore. So, frankly, we don't find the government explanation terribly persuasive, and to the extent that it is, why now decide to pay attention to your zoning laws in this way?
I'm informed that we need to vacate this room shortly, and because we started so late. That's not your fault. It's people who run this place. But I want to give you an opportunity to, if there's any last comments that you want to make that you think are important to have on the record, I'd welcome this opportunity to have you do so now.
If I could just add one thing about Physicians for Human Rights differentiates between beatings and torture. We document both in our report. What we mean by torture is, of course, the UN definition of extreme physical or mental suffering inflicted on a person by security forces, by government authorities, with the intent, for example, to force a confession. What I did not state earlier is that inside the hospital itself, on the 6th floor of Salminia Hospital, we received corroborated testimonies that patients who were there recovering from gunshot wounds and tear gas inhalation were actually being tortured by security forces inside the hospital, that these security forces turned on a video cassette recorder and filmed the beatings and filmed the forced confessions. What's important to this discussion as well is what the security forces reportedly were forcing these patients to say. For example, that Iran was behind the protests, that the civilian protesters received arms and swords and other weapons from Iran, or that these people would be receiving military training in Iran. And so this is a really insidious campaign of not only human rights violations, but also linking it to Iran to spread and sow fear.
I would like to, in conclusion, say that I'm not here today to represent anyone. I'm not representing people who are protesting, and I'm not here to represent people who are supporting the government. I'm here only to report on human rights violations, and I think that in that regards to human rights violations in Bahrain, the situation is going from bad to worse. And I've been receiving, since the morning when people found out that I'm coming here to testify, many messages of people asking me, or rather begging me to ask people here to try to do whatever they can to protect them from the Bahraini government and the human rights violations that are occurring there. So I wanted to pass along that message. Thank you.
I just want to reiterate one point, which is that the focus today was on Bahrain, but what the U.S. does or does not do, or says or does not say with regard to Bahrain, has implications for the whole region, for the U.S. credibility on that score. And then just one last point, I would hope that this kind of hearing could be held by a committee of the House that has subpoena power, so that we do have representatives of the U.S. government present as well.
I appreciate that final thought. I appreciate all your comments here today. Let me again reiterate what I said at the beginning. I mean, this focus is about human rights. This is not about, you know, supporting one side or the other. It's about the situation that unfortunately is unfolding right now. And you know, and I think, quite frankly, as was stated, that the United States is kind of late to the game in terms of speaking out against some of the violations that, you know, are being documented firsthand. And you know, and to the government of Bahrain, I mean, I would simply urge them to take these comments seriously and constructively. You know, there are two ways for governments to deal with human rights challenges. One is to ignore the concerns and to get defensive and to not remedy anything. The other way is to actually address these concerns and remedy the situation. And I think to the extent that governments do that, I think it reflects well on them. And as I mentioned at the outset, we do have a relationship with Bahrain. Our two countries have an important strategic relationship, and I hope that relationship continues and grows. But when it comes to human rights, and I can't believe I'm quoting the Wall Street Journal because I very rarely agree with anything they say, but when it comes to human rights, the editorial page, not the other stuff. But when it comes to human rights, I mean, it's just not right for us to give the government a pass on this. And my hope is that some of these concerns that you raised today will be addressed, and we're not going away. I mean, we're going to continue to monitor the situation, take some of the recommendations that you have made seriously, and we will talk to some of our other colleagues about